Imagine being a young American soldier in the forests of Belgium in December 1944. Snow blankets the Ardennes woods, and an eerie quiet hangs in the air. Many Allied troops believe the war in Europe is nearly won. Some optimistically say it'll be over by Christmas. Suddenly, just before dawn on December 16th, that silence is shattered by the thunder of almost 2,000 German artillery guns. The frozen ground shakes violently as shells scream overhead. In that terrifying moment, you realize Adolf Hitler has launched a massive surprise attack. This is the beginning of the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last desperate gamble on the Western Front. And at its heart, one small town will become the symbol of American defiance: Bastogne. Chapter 1. The winter of 1944. Hitler strikes back. By late 1944, Nazi Germany was being pushed back on all fronts. Allied forces had stormed ashore on D-Day in June and liberated France. Now they stood at Germany's western border, confident the war was winding down. Hitler, however, had other ideas. In a final bid to turn the tide, he conceived a bold counter-offensive in the west. His plan? Secretly mass armies in the dense Ardennes forest and punch through the thin American lines where they least expected. He aimed to drive his forces all the way to Antwerp, Belgium's vital port, splitting the British and American armies in two. If successful, this surprise attack might force the Western Allies to negotiate a truce, allowing Germany to focus on the Soviets in the east. It was an all-or-nothing roll of the dice. Hitler's last gamble to snatch victory from near defeat. Just before dawn on December 16, 1944, the German attack struck with devastating force. Without warning, a thunderous 90-minute barrage from thousands of artillery pieces pummeled the Allied front line in the Ardennes. Shocked and outnumbered, American units guarding this quiet sector were caught completely off guard. Under the cover of heavy fog and winter storms, elite German panzer divisions and infantry swarmed forward. They smashed into American positions, overrunning villages and encircling bewildered GIs. Chaos erupted along an 80-mile front. Allied commands scrambled to figure out what was happening. Was this just a local counterattack, or something far bigger? As reports poured in, it became clear. Hitler's grand offensive was underway, and it was creating a huge bulge in the Allied lines. In the offensive's path lay thick forests, icy roads, and small Belgian towns. Among these was Bastogne, a quaint market town nestled amid woods and farmland. Bastogne wasn't large, but it held immense strategic value. 7 major roads converged there, radiating out toward all corners of the Ardennes. The Germans themselves nicknamed Bastogne the Road Octopus. Any army needing to maneuver tanks and supplies through the region had to control those roads, and thus Bastogne. Hitler's plan demanded a swift capture of this crossroads. If German panzers seized Bastogne's roads, they could speed toward Antwerp. If not, the advance would slow and splinter. So as the German tide surged forward, Bastogne became a prime objective. The stage was set for a fierce showdown over this vital crossroads town. Chapter 2. Surrounded at Bastogne. On December 17th, as the scope of the German assault became evident, Allied commanders rushed reinforcements to plug the gaps. Among the units diverted was the US 101st Airborne Division, the famed Screaming Eagles. These battle-hardened paratroopers had just been resting in France after fighting in Holland. With no time to lose, they were loaded onto open trucks and sent racing north in frigid winter weather. They traveled over 100 miles through snow and sleet, day and night, to reach Bastogne before the enemy did. Joining them were combat command elements of the 10th Armored Division and other support units, all thrown in as a makeshift force to hold the town. Exhausted and undersupplied, the 101st Airborne arrived in the Bastogne area on December 19th, mere hours ahead of the German vanguard. In fact, lead American tank units reached Bastogne just 4 hours before the Germans. There was no time to dig elaborate defenses or gather ample ammunition. They fanned out quickly, taking positions in the surrounding woods and villages to form a perimeter. Everyone understood the situation. They were likely to be encircled, and they braced themselves to hold out as long as possible. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, the division artillery commander, was acting commander of the 101st, since the division's commanding general was away. McAuliffe and his men prepared for the worst, vowing to defend Bastogne at all costs. By December 20th and 21st, the German noose tightened around Bastogne. 7 roads led into town, and German troops methodically cut them one by one. Panzers and infantry attacked from all sides, probing for a weak point. American paratroopers fought desperately in villages like Noville, Foy, and Marvy, on the outskirts of Bastogne. In each clash, they stalled the Germans as long as possible before falling back to the next line. Casualties mounted, and the winter weather was brutally cold. Foxholes dug into the frozen ground offered little shelter from the sub-zero temperatures and biting wind. Soldiers lacked proper winter clothing, many wrapping themselves in blankets or scavenged enemy coats to fight off frostbite. They were low on food, low on ammunition, and the incoming German fire never let up for long. Amid these harsh conditions, the troops' resolve only hardened. Medics worked feverishly in basement aid stations to care for the wounded with dwindling supplies. The town's civilians huddled in cellars as shells hit, sharing whatever food they had with the American defenders. Still, the 101st Airborne and attached units refused to give an inch without a fight. When a tank or artillery piece ran out of shells, infantrymen held the line with rifles and machine guns. When one village became untenable, survivors fell back to reinforce the town itself. Bastogne was soon completely surrounded, cut off from any Allied help. By nightfall of December 21st, the Germans controlled all roads out. The men of Bastogne were effectively trapped behind enemy lines, like an island in a sea of hostile forces. Inside the besieged town, General McAuliffe kept morale as high as he could. He moved among his troops, encouraging them and cracking the occasional joke despite the dire situation. "They've got us surrounded, the poor bastards," one officer quipped, turning grim reality into a point of pride. Each man knew that holding Bastogne was buying time for the overall battle. Their stubborn defense was disrupting the German timetable, preventing a rapid breakthrough. But as ammunition and medical supplies ran dangerously low, and as more wounded piled up, everyone wondered how long they could last. The Germans, sensing the Americans' predicament, decided to play a trump card to break their will. On the morning of December 22nd, Bastogne's defenders awoke to an unexpected development. White flags waving on the road, and a group of German soldiers approaching under a flag of truce. Chapter 3. Nuts. Defiance in Bastogne. It was around 11:30 a.m. on December 22nd, 1944. Peering over their foxholes in the snowy fields south of Bastogne, American sentries from the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment spotted a curious sight. 4 German soldiers were advancing toward the lines, 2 of them holding white bedsheets high in the air. Immediately, wary US troops trained their rifles on the visitors. The German party consisted of 2 officers and 2 enlisted men. One of the officers, speaking English, called out that they had a message for the American commander. After some tense moments, the Germans were met by US soldiers and blindfolded, standard procedure for enemy envoys, to be escorted to General McAuliffe's headquarters. The fate of Bastogne hung in the balance as those envoys carried with them a written ultimatum. In a dimly lit basement of a building in Bastogne, serving as the division command post, Brigadier General McAuliffe was caught catnapping when the call came in. A staff officer rushed in and reported, "Sir, the Germans are here to demand our surrender." Blinking awake from his sleeping bag, McAuliffe's first groggy reaction was a phrase of disbelief and annoyance. "Nuts!" He had literally blurted out the word that would soon make history. McAuliffe climbed out of bed and gathered his thoughts as his staff brought him the formal surrender letter. Typed in English, the German message was stern and ominous. It emphasized the hopeless situation of the American forces encircled at Bastogne. It warned that a refusal to surrender would result in their total annihilation by massed German artillery, with a 2-hour deadline to decide. It even added a taunt, suggesting that if the Americans failed to yield, the Germans would rain destruction that would cause many civilian casualties, implying that further resistance would be on the Americans' conscience, not exactly in line with well-known American humanity. McAuliffe read the ultimatum with mounting anger. Surrender! The 101st Airborne had never surrendered, and certainly wasn't about to start now, not when they had held out this long. In fact, despite their challenges, the Americans in Bastogne had repelled every attack so far. Outraged by the audacity of the demand, McAuliffe tossed the letter aside. "Us surrender," he growled. "Oh, nuts." For a moment he stomped around furiously, venting to his officers about the ridiculous demand. But the clock was ticking on the Germans' 2-hour deadline. They expected an official reply. Calming down, McAuliffe scratched his head, trying to think of what message to send back. He turned to his gathered staff and admitted, "Well, I don't know what to tell them." Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kinnard, the division operations officer, broke the silence with a grin. "That first remark of yours would be hard to beat, General." The staff chuckled and quickly agreed. McAuliffe's puzzled look turned into a slow smile as he realized what Kinnard meant. His spontaneous exclamation, "Nuts!" would be his answer. It was perfect, succinct, benign, and quintessentially American. McAuliffe grabbed a notepad and scribbled the single word, "Nuts." Liking the idea more and more, he had it typed up on official letterhead. Soon, on a plain piece of paper, a clerk centered the message and typed, "That was it." One word, followed by the signature of the American commander. McAuliffe summoned the waiting German envoys back to receive the reply. Colonel Joseph Harper of the 327th Glider Infantry volunteered to deliver the message to the enemy representatives at the front line. Harper drove out under a white flag to the spot where the blindfolded German major and lieutenant waited. Handing them the folded note, he declared, "The American commander's reply is on that paper." The German major and lieutenant opened it, looked at the single baffling word, and then looked at Harper in confusion. "Nuts?" one of the German officers said, not grasping the slang. "What does this mean?" he asked. Harper hesitated and smirked. How to translate an American colloquialism like nuts? Finally, he gave a plain explanation. "It means the same as go to hell." Perhaps not a literal translation, but it conveyed the spirit well enough. "The reply is decidedly negative," Harper added dryly. He then offered a parting warning. If the Germans continued their attack, the American troops would fight to the last and inflict tremendous casualties on them. The German major, now understanding the message, nodded curtly. Blindfolds were put back on, and the envoys were escorted back to their lines. The Americans watched as the German party disappeared into the snow and fog. General McAuliffe's one-word retort, "Nuts," raced through the ranks of Bastogne's defenders, boosting their morale. Tired, cold soldiers shared a laugh at their commander's plucky reply. In the middle of a brutal siege, this bit of bravado was like a shot of adrenaline. The men knew now, if there was any doubt before, that surrender was not an option. The 101st Airborne and their comrades would hold Bastogne or die trying. The German ultimatum had backfired. Instead of intimidating the Americans into giving up, it steeled their resolve to fight on. As for the German commanders, they were reportedly bemused by the strange answer. When the "nuts" message was relayed up the chain of command, one German general shook his head, puzzled at the American slang. Another German officer, upon finally understanding it, remarked with irritation that it was time to resume the attack and blast Bastogne into submission. The siege would indeed continue, but now the mythos of Bastogne had a new chapter. "Nuts" became a rallying cry of American grit and defiance in the face of overwhelming odds. Chapter 4. Holding the line in the cold. After delivering their defiant reply, the men of Bastogne buckled down for whatever the Germans would throw at them next. The enemy had promised annihilation, and though their threatened massive artillery barrage did not immediately materialize, the situation remained dire. The weather was still miserable. A thick fog and low clouds hung over the region, grounding Allied supply planes and preventing air support. The besieged troops were nearly out of critical supplies. Ammunition had to be rationed to only the most essential targets. Food was scarce. Many paratroopers were down to their last pieces of chocolate, hardtack crackers, or whatever they'd scrounged from abandoned farms. Medical supplies were so low that medics reused bandages or sterilized and repurposed them as best they could. And yet, the American line around Bastogne held firm. German forces continued to attack the perimeter from multiple directions. Each day and night brought skirmishes and probing assaults. The town of Bastogne itself came under bombardment from German artillery and even strafing runs by Luftwaffe aircraft when weather allowed. Buildings were reduced to rubble. The historic town square saw shells land among its stone houses and church, sending civilians and soldiers diving for cover. In the freezing foxholes and tree-lined trenches at places like Bois-Jacques, Jack's Wood, just outside Bastogne, American paratroopers hunkered down as mortar shells and tank fire blasted the forest. Trees were splintered into kindling by the blasts, in what survivors later called the wooden minefield, as exploding tree trunks sent wooden shrapnel flying as dangerously as any mine. Soldiers pressed themselves into the earth, enduring the storm of steel and splinters, holding their ground. Despite suffering from hunger, frostbite, and exhaustion, the defending troops showed remarkable tenacity. When German tanks rolled forward, the Americans sprang into action with whatever they had. Bazooka teams lying in wait behind hedgerows, tank destroyer crews ambushing panzers at crossroads, artillery observers calling down rapid-fire missions from the few howitzers still with ammunition. Time and again, the Germans would mass for a furious assault on one sector of the perimeter, only to be met with concentrated American fire that stalled them. The 101st Airborne's artillery units became masters of improvisation. Even low on shells, they would swiftly shift their guns to mass fire on each threatened point in sequence, giving the illusion of greater firepower. Meanwhile, reserve teams, often a hastily gathered mix of clerks, cooks, and drivers turned riflemen, plugged any gaps that opened. One notable attack came on Christmas Eve. Under cover of darkness, German infantry supported by tanks tried to infiltrate the lines near the village of Marvy. Tracer rounds streaked across the night as a fierce firefight erupted. For a moment it looked like the enemy might break through into Bastogne itself, but American paratroopers, with help from a few Sherman tanks, managed to repel the assault after bitter close-quarters fighting. All through the night, flares and explosions lit up the winter sky. In the morning, the defenders were still holding strong. Christmas Day dawned cold and grey, with snow drifting down. In Bastogne, December 25, 1944 was a somber holiday. There were no big meals or packages from home for these GIs, just another day of survival. Yet, in an impromptu Christmas celebration, some soldiers sang carols in their foxholes to lift their spirits, and chaplains led small services in cellars for those who could attend. General McAuliffe issued a Christmas message to his men, praising their courage and urging them to keep up the good work. He told them that relief was on the way, they just had to hang on a little longer. Unbeknownst to Bastogne's defenders, that relief was already in motion. The U.S. Third Army, led by the fiery General George S. Patton, had pivoted its forces to come to Bastogne's aid. In one of the war's great logistical feats, Patton had halted his own offensive elsewhere and turned his army northward through terrible winter conditions to rescue the surrounded division. He had even prayed for clear weather to allow his tanks and the Allied air forces to operate. As if in answer, on December 23rd, the skies finally cleared after a week of fog. Suddenly, the distant drone of aircraft engines was heard, a welcome sound that brought smiles and tears to Bastogne's weary fighters. Allied cargo planes swooped in low over Bastogne, braving anti-aircraft fire, to drop parachute bundles of supplies. It was a dramatic aerial resupply. Hundreds of bundles floated down, containing ammunition, rations, medical kits, and even Christmas mail. Medic Eugene Rowe of the 101st scrambled to recover medical supplies from the snow, overjoyed to find plasma and bandages to treat the wounded. Scenes like this would later be famously depicted in the mini-series Band of Brothers. These supply drops were life-saving. The men cheered as much-needed food and ammo arrived from the skies. Their bellies ached a little less that night, and their guns could bark a little louder the next day. With clear skies, Allied fighter bombers also roared into action. U.S. Army Air Forces pilots strafed German positions around Bastogne and bombed convoys attempting to reinforce the siege. The Luftwaffe tried to counterattack. Bombs fell on Bastogne town, tragically hitting a makeshift hospital and causing civilian and medic casualties. But overall, the Allied air presence was a game-changer. The balance was slowly shifting. The Germans, once so confident, now faced an American garrison that was rejuvenated with supplies and supported from above. Still, the encirclement remained unbroken on the ground, and the enemy was determined to crush Bastogne before Patton's armor arrived. The defenders steeled themselves for a few more nights of desperate resistance. Each day they held out was a victory in itself, delaying Hitler's timetable, bleeding his forces, and setting the stage for a counterblow.
Chapter 5. Relief arrives. Bastogne holds, Hitler's gamble fails. On December 26, 1944, after a week of siege, the rumble of artillery to the south signaled that help was near. General Patton's Third Army had fought its way through snow and German opposition in a lightning drive to relieve Bastogne. Lead elements of the 4th Armored Division, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, namesake of the modern Abrams tank, spearheaded the final push. That afternoon, American tanks from Abrams' task force broke through the German lines at a small village just south of Bastogne. In the distance, surrounded soldiers could see muzzle flashes and hear the booming of tank guns coming closer and closer. Then, at about 4:50 p.m., the first friendly tank crested the ridge on the southern road into Bastogne. A cheer went up among the 101st Airborne troops as they realized their comrades had arrived. Men who had endured the hellish week embraced each other, laughing and whooping despite their exhaustion. Relief had arrived at last. A historic meeting took place on the road outside Bastogne. Troops of the 101st Airborne greeted the advancing tankers of the 4th Armored Division. One account describes paratroopers, grinning despite their gaunt faces, slapping the sides of the tanks, and exchanging cigarettes and handshakes with the relieved tank crews. The siege was officially broken. A narrow corridor had been opened, linking Bastogne to Allied territory. Almost immediately, supply trucks and ambulances began rolling in. Fresh troops helped push back the enemy and widen the corridor. Wounded soldiers who had been patiently suffering in Bastogne's aid stations were finally evacuated to proper hospitals. For the first time in days, the defenders could relax their constant vigil at least a little, knowing they were no longer alone. Bastogne had been saved. However, the battle was not over. The German forces did not simply melt away after Patton's breakthrough. Fierce fighting continued around Bastogne for days as the Allies worked to expand the relief corridor and the Germans tried, unsuccessfully, to re-establish the encirclement. The 101st Airborne, though officially relieved, promptly joined Patton's forces in offensive operations to reclaim villages still under enemy control. In early January 1945, these weary but unbowed paratroopers helped seize towns like Foy and Neuville that they had been forced to abandon during the siege's early days. It was payback time. Inch by inch, the Allied counterattack erased the Bulge. The weather remained bitterly cold, and the terrain was littered with wreckage of war. But the initiative had clearly swung to the Allies. Hitler's grand offensive had stalled. By late January 1945, the Battle of the Bulge finally ground to an end. The bulge in the lines was flattened out as German forces retreated to their starting positions, having failed to reach their objectives. Hitler's last gamble had cost his army dearly. Tanks destroyed, units decimated, irreplaceable fuel and resources spent. For the Americans, the Battle of the Bulge was the bloodiest single campaign of the war. Over 80,000 American casualties, including about 19,000 killed. But it was also one of the US Army's finest hours, a testament to the grit and determination of its soldiers. Nowhere was that more evident than at Bastogne. The stand at Bastogne became legendary, a story told in newspapers back home, and later immortalized in books and films. The men of the 101st Airborne Division came out of the siege battered and frostbitten, but victorious. They earned a new nickname, proudly calling themselves the battered bastards of Bastogne. In the bigger picture, the defense of Bastogne had strategic importance. By holding that crossroads, the Americans significantly disrupted the German timetable. The delay prevented the enemy from driving westward to capture deeper objectives
like the Meuse River crossings or Antwerp. Bastogne's refusal to surrender forced the Germans to divert troops and precious time, luxuries Hitler's plan could not afford. In essence, the defiance of the 101st at Bastogne blunted the spearhead of the entire German offensive. 4 days after McAuliffe's nuts reply, Patton arrived, and from then on, the German initiative faded. What began as a powerful surprise attack ended as a failed offensive that left Germany weakened and on the defensive for the rest of the war. In the months after, Allied forces pressed into Germany, and by May 1945, the war in Europe was over. At Bastogne, though, the winter memories lingered. In the town, grateful Belgian civilians celebrated their American liberators, who had stood with them through the darkest hours. Ever since, Bastogne has honored the heroes of 1944. There's a town square named Place McAuliffe, where a preserved American tank stands as a monument. Every year, commemorations recall that Christmas in 1944, when the town held firm. And always, the word nuts echoes with a special pride. The story of Bastogne remains one of ordinary soldiers doing the extraordinary. They were cold, hungry, and outgunned, but they refused to give up. Faced with an enemy demanding their surrender, they answered with a single audacious word that still resounds decades later. That one word, nuts, captures the spirit of defiance, courage, and even a touch of American humor in the face of impossible odds. It was the perfect response to Hitler's last gamble. The 101st Airborne, surrounded at Bastogne, would never surrender. Their stand helped ensure that the Bulge would be Hitler's final failure, and that freedom would prevail. The legacy of their bravery is a tale for the ages, a reminder that sometimes, when all hope seems lost, grit and guts can turn the tide. And if a foe ever asks you to surrender when you know you must not, you can always smile and say, just like General McAuliffe did in 1944, nuts!